Who is the main character, so to speak, of the Bible? Obviously, the answer to that is God. But of course, if you look at the New Testament, the part of the Bible written by Christians in the first century, written in Greek, it's very, very focused on the man Jesus of Nazareth, aka the Son of God. This lecture is about God and the Son of God and how the two are related according to the New Testament. I'm using the term logic here in two different senses. In one sense, logic means the underlying assumptions or the underlying thought processes and reasoning of a person or an author. In another sense, logic is a formal science that's very closely related to mathematics. Logic is an artificial language. It's a made-up, super precise language. Now, why would you make up a language when you have perfectly good languages like English or Chinese or German? Why would you make up an artificial language when you have so many existing natural languages? The answer is that an artificial language, a logic, removes ambiguities and gives us a precise rendering of a statement, a precise translation, and this helps us to carefully evaluate individual statements and also complete arguments. And you'll see how that works in just a minute. On this topic of God and His Son, there's quite a lot of confusion about this, and there's a pretty good amount of disagreement between Christians about this. I think logic helps you to look very closely at a text and see what is being said there and what is implied by what is said there. Logic helps us to dig beneath the grammar to get at the structure of what is being said. Now, who is Jesus? Is Jesus God Himself? Is Jesus something like a part of God? Is Jesus a different person than His Father, but the same being and the same God as His Father? Well, let's see if logic can help. I claim that it can help. I'm going to give you a crash course in logic. This is the type of logic that you would get in a university in an introduction to deductive logic class. Specifically, we'll be using the kind of logic that logicians call first-order predicate logic with quantification. There's some technicality to this. You'll have to be patient for this first portion of the talk. You might find yourself asking in a few minutes, what is the point of all this technicality? Well, the whole point is to enable you to precisely understand what John and Paul say about Jesus and God. No, not this John and Paul, much more important John and Paul. I mean John, the author of the fourth gospel, and Paul, the author of all those letters in the New Testament, like Romans and 1 Corinthians and so on. So let's get to the logic. We call this language predicate logic because it involves letters that stand for predicates, and by convention we use capital letters for a predicate. So a predicate is what's being said about the subject. Here it's being an emperor. That's the predicate E, and then we've put that together with a lowercase letter, which is a name that refers to an individual. So the small c is a name for the man Constantine. E is a predicate for being an emperor. If you wanted to say, I don't know, that Dale was an emperor, you would just use a letter D for my name. This would read out Dale is an emperor. So either one of these sentences, Constantine is an emperor or Constantine is emperor, would be translated by this very simple sentence, which only involves two letters. We just have to know what the interpretation of those letters is. Now here's a symbol, this arrow, and this is what logicians use for what we call the material conditional, or more simply an if-then statement. So if you want to say something like, if Constantine is an emperor, then he is powerful, you use two predicates, E and P, for being an emperor and for being powerful. You use the one named C for Constantine, and you connect them with the arrow. And this just says, well, what our sentence up here says. If Constantine is an emperor, then he is powerful. Notice this sentence is not saying that Constantine is an emperor, and it's not saying that Constantine is powerful, but it's saying if the first, then the second. So it's a purely hypothetical or conditional statement. Now if we add another premise to this argument, that Constantine is emperor, or is an emperor, either one, that implies this conclusion below the line, therefore Constantine is powerful. we should note that this is what logicians call a valid argument. A valid argument just means that the premises imply the conclusion. In other words, if this is true and if this is true, then that forces this to be true as well. So the premises together force a conclusion to be true. It's absolutely impossible to have each of those premises be true and the conclusion be false. That's what philosophers call a valid argument, and this argument is definitely valid. Anybody can see that. If you had committed yourself to this being true, and you had committed yourself to this being true, that Constantine is emperor, then you would have already committed yourself, right, to this being true. So you realize that this is a valid argument. Every child can tell that this is a valid argument. You probably just haven't heard that terminology before unless you've taken a class in logic. A lot of times we want to talk not just about a certain individual or a couple individuals. We want to talk about everything or everything of a certain kind. To do that, we need a universal quantifier. There are two quantifiers in standard logic that's taught in an introductory class. The first of them is called the universal quantifier, and we use this funny upside down A for it. If P means that something is powerful, then this sentence just reads everything whatever is powerful. So when you have a universal quantifier, you need to use a variable. Typically we use like a lowercase x or y or z. Again, this just says for any x whatever, that x is powerful. Every x is p, everything is powerful. Now this is a strange sentence because it's about everything whatever. The universal quantifier is unrestricted here. It ranges over absolutely everything in reality, which is strange. This is probably a false sentence, right? That everything is powerful. A mouse isn't powerful, an electron isn't powerful. It may depend on what you mean by powerful, but anyway, that sentence is probably going to be false. Now, more typically, we want to talk not about everything whatever, but about everything of a certain kind, like all the people in this room, all women, all Americans, something like that. To do this, you use a universal quantifier with an if-then statement. So if you want to say that every emperor is powerful, you would translate that into logic like this. For any x whatever, if that x is an emperor, then that x is powerful. Right? Every emperor is powerful. So we're not talking about every being in existence, everything whatever, like we are up here. We're talking about every emperor, right? And we're saying something about every emperor that is powerful. Consider this argument. Every emperor is powerful. Rufus is not powerful. Therefore, Rufus is not an emperor. If you just look at the English for the moment, you can see that this is a valid argument. If you had committed yourself to this being true, and you had also committed yourself to this being true, you were already committed to this, right? So if this is true and this is true, then that's going to force the conclusion to be true as well. In other words, it's valid. Now let's look at the logical translation for a second. We've seen how to translate the first premise just a moment ago. Every emperor is powerful. For any x whatever, if it is an emperor, then it is powerful. And then we're talking about an individual here, Rufus, and we're saying that he's not powerful. Now, we don't have to have a different predicate for not powerful. We just use the predicate for powerful, and we preface it by this not symbol here, which just means it's not the case that. So it's not the case that Rufus is powerful. Yes, it logically follows from those that it's not the case that Rufus is an emperor. Why? Because every emperor is powerful and he's not. So therefore, it follows that Rufus is not an emperor. So far so good. That's not too bad, right? So let's take a look at the other quantifier. We call this the existential quantifier, and we use this funny backwards E to represent it. So the simplest kind of sentence, again using P for the predicate, is powerful. EXPX, that just means that there is a P, or that there is something which is P. And to clarify, what it really means is it really means that there is at least one P. There might be two, there might be five, there might be a million, there might be an infinity. But anyway, there's not zero of them. There's at least one thing which is P. We're making an assertion of existence. That's why we call it the existential quantifier. There's at least one thing of a certain sort. Very often we want to say that there's one thing which is two particular ways. To say that, we use the existential quantifier and a couple of different predicates, and we use this AND symbol, which looks like an upside down V. In some older logic textbooks you might see it written like this, just a dot. Same thing. That's how you translate that there is a powerful emperor. That is, there is at least one powerful emperor. That is, there is some x such that px and also ex. There is some x which is powerful and also which is an emperor. Which is to say, there is at least one powerful emperor. We're almost done with the technicalities. One more. Consider this gentleman, the previous president of the United States before Barack Obama, George W. Bush. He goes by many names. Some people call him the Shrub, some call him George Bush Jr., some call him the worst man since Hitler. They call him all kinds of stuff. One thing they call him is Bush. That's one name, and that refers to this individual smiling right here in this official picture. Others, I think actually Bush himself, calls him W. That refers to the same individual. So the sentence in logic D equals B means that W just is Bush, that W and Bush are numerically one, or numerically the same. This is a funny kind of statement, and it implies that D and B are co-referential terms. It turns out that it's an important sort of statement. Let's look at another famous leader who inspires extreme love or hate reactions. This is the 4th century emperor Constantine. We've already seen how to say Constantine is an emperor in logic. It's just this very simple sentence, EC. C, the name for Constantine, E, the predicate for being an emperor. The is represented just by our putting them together. We've seen how to make a statement about an individual. We've seen how to make a statement about all things of a certain sort. We've seen how to make a statement that there is at least one thing of a sort, or one thing of two different sorts. But how do we say that an item is the only thing of a certain sort? This we have not seen yet, but it turns out that we already have the tools to translate only sentences into logic. If you say that Constantine is an emperor, you're saying this. If you're saying that Constantine is the only emperor, you're saying the first part, yes, and, there's the and symbol again, you're also saying this second part, and that's the only part there. So you're saying that Constantine is emperor, and for any x whatever, if x is an emperor, then x just is Constantine. X is numerically identical to Constantine. Right? Do you see how that captures the only? So I've given sort of a halfway translation here. It's not quite in logic or in proper English. Maybe it'll help. You can read this as C is E, and for any x, x is E only if x just is C. So he's emperor, and also he's the only one. Any emperor there is just is him. Turns out that you can also translate that sort of sentence using only an existential quantifier. So equivalently, you can translate it like this. Again, same thing for the first part. Constantine is an emperor, and it's not the case that there is some x, which is emperor, and it's not the case that x is C. This part would say, let me shield off the not symbol. Remember the not symbol, that funny thing that looks like a tipped over L? That. If I was to shield off that not, just the part here that I bracketed says there is an x such that x is an emperor, and it's not the case that x is C. But we've negated that whole thing. So we've said Constantine is emperor, And it's not the case that there is some X which is emperor and which isn't him. So that's how you say he's the only emperor. Again, if you say he's the only emperor, you're saying two things and not one. There's only one way for this to be false, which is if Constantine isn't an emperor at all. There are two ways for this to be false, this more complex statement. Either, again, it could be that Constantine is not emperor, so that this conjunct, this component, is false. Or it could be that he's not the only one. So this could be false, or this could be false. If either one of those is false, then the whole "and" statement is false. So maybe he is an emperor, but there is a co-emperor at the time. Well, then it would be false that he's the only emperor, and the whole thing would be false. So, right, if we had this be true, but that be false, the whole statement would be false. So again, that's a way that you can see that more is being said in this second statement. There are two ways it can be false and not just one. Okay, that's all the technicalities I needed to show you. Next time, as promised, we will apply this to John and Paul.